I'm Jessica from the Writing Lab, if I haven't met you already. Thanks for being willing to move the schedule so that we could do this a week later than we planned. But I'm going to talk to you about MLA Style, which has recently changed. So if anybody's already been using it in high school or in your Comp 1 class before this or any other class, it's changed. So we're going to go over what's different and kind of talk about how to do that. All right, there are only so many ways for me to make this exciting. So I'm just going to do my best, but just stay with me. Try to hold questions until the end. I know you'll be tempted maybe to interrupt in the middle, but I've done it in a specific order for a reason. So just hang on, and then if you have questions, let me know, and we'll get to those at the end, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and start. When we talk about MLA, sometimes students come into the writing lab where I work and supervise, and they ask me, what is MLA? When do I need to use it? What is that? It's a couple of things. It's when the way you set up your document, so what it looks like, it could be considered MLA format, but the way you document your sources is MLA style, right? So you're going to be using it, that's everything from where your page numbers go to the fact that it's double spaced, that's considered MLA. But then also the way that you document your sources in your text and at the end of your paper. So all of that is included. I sort of think of it like we need a format so that everybody who reads an MLA paper, so that when you come to the writing lab, for example, I know where to find certain pieces of information. I always explain it to students like, even though I might drive a Toyota and you might drive a Honda, if I get in your car, I know where the turn signal is, right? So a format helps me understand those things. The turn signal might look different, your car might be completely different from mine, but the things I need to find the most, the brake, for example, right, is going to be in the same spot so that it's easy to find if I drive your car. And MLA works that way too. If we all follow the format properly, then it should be able to transfer from one class to the next, for example. One thing that students often forget is that they need to use hanging indent on the Works Cited page. That's a specific way that it's supposed to look. So pay attention to all the little details. Part of MLA is making sure that the punctuation is correct and that everything looks the way it's supposed to. If you've used MLA before, the good news is that there are a lot of things that have stayed the same. There are plenty of changes, but there are some things that have stayed the same. Some of those things are the way that the document looks, right? You're still double spacing, you're still, using 1-inch margins, all those kinds of things. Your Works Cited page still looks the same, even though your entries are going to be in a different order, but it still looks the same. And your in-text citations, which we're going to talk about much later in the presentation, still are basically the same thing, right? We're using an author and a page number, or a title of an article and a page number, right? Okay. Again, just a few slides for those of you who've used it before, and then we'll get into starting off and explaining those of you who haven't, okay? To start out with, if you're used to the old way of doing things, usually what's happening is I'm having a lot of students come into the writing lab and they'll ask me for help with citing their sources. And I'll look at their citations and I'll say, did you use one of those citation creator things? How many of you have heard of EasyBib, citation generation machine, those kinds of things, right? The bad news is that most of those haven't been updated. So if you turn a paper in and you use one of those things, or if you use the one that's in Microsoft Word, you can say, cite my sources for me, those things mostly haven't been updated to the new version of MLA, because this happened over the summer. So using those things could unless your instructor is being really lenient, could sort of steer you in the wrong direction. And there's some ways to immediately tell that you're using the wrong one. One of those is that you have a publication city. You tell me that it was published in New York. Those of you who've tried to cite sources know that often what happens is they'll list 3 or 4 cities. It'll say New York and Boston and London. So it's kind of a good thing that we got rid of this because we don't know exactly where that book was published anymore. So we're just skipping that altogether. Also, I see that you'll have something like print or web listed. You'll have the type of source listed. A lot of the citation generators will give you that piece of information. They'll ask you for that. Problem is, we don't need it anymore. We're not listing the type of source because the way we're going to craft the citation is going to tell us what type of source it is. It'll be obvious and easy, which makes things a little easier for us. In the past, we have said don't put URLs, don't put web addresses, hyperlinks to your sites that you're using on your Works Cited page. Now we're saying let's include those, and you can even leave them clickable so that your instructor, if you turn your paper in through Canvas, for example, your instructor can just click right on the article that you used, and then we'll know exactly what you were looking at, okay? You can't just include those, though, so pay attention to that, because some students just add a list of links, and that's not a Works Cited page, okay? But we are going to include them as part of the publication information that we put on the Works Cited page. In the past, we had to have an access date. So there were basically 2 dates when we were using websites. We would say, I accessed it on this day, it's a web source, and it was published on this day. Now, as long as you have a publication date, you don't have to include an access date anymore. Now, if you don't, you'll have to include it, and I'll show you some examples of both later on. So the access date is only if you can't find any other dates. And one thing we're going to talk about a lot in here is that you really need to search for these things. Students will come to the writing lab and be like, this source has no author. And I'll look at the web page and I'll be like, what about that name right there? Oh, is that the person who wrote it? Probably, right? But because you didn't immediately see it, you just say, it doesn't have one. No, we have to search for these things sometimes, unfortunately, because not every article is going to be set up the same way, right? But it's important to do so because if you wrote an article, wouldn't you want someone to include your name and give you credit for that? Probably, right? Okay, so a couple other little things. In the past, you would see those citations, especially from those generators, would say 39.2. Now we're going to write it out. Volume 39, number 2. We're going to write it out like that. In the past, we had this confusion where we had the ED, and we would say 3rd edition ED, but we would also say editor ED, which got confusing. So now we're going to switch that out. So we're going to write edited by before the editor. With the page numbers, we're going to include the PP before them if there are multiple pages. If there's one page, we're just going to say P, like P36, okay? And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Also, pay attention to things like punctuation. I tried to make them a different color in all of my examples so you can see that there's mostly commas now. Instead of before, I would tell you, put a period after each part. And that's another way that I can tell you're using a citation generator is because you're using periods instead of commas. Okay, so when I talk to students about citing sources, one thing I realize is that those of us who teach English classes, or any class that involves documenting sources, use words and terms that you aren't familiar with. And so sometimes when I say, well, look it up in your handbook or look it up on our website, you can't look it up because you don't know the terms. So I'm going to make sure we have a couple of terms figured out before we kind of move on to talking about the sources. One of those is that we always call things an anthology. You might think you've never had an anthology, but most of you have. If you have, how many of you have used the They Say, I Say book? Anybody? Yes? Okay. What about taking a literature class that has Norton Anthology? Okay, well you will soon, right? So what those are collections of things. Collections of articles, collections of short stories, things like that. And so you're going to need to, when we're going to talk about an edited anthology, we have someone who edits everything, who compiles everything and pulls it all together. Then we have individual authors inside. And a lot of times when you look up how to cite a source, anthology will be listed. Another thing that students don't always know about or think about is that there's a copyright page in all books. And there's a copyright date on most websites. So I'm going to use that term. What that basically means is if I wrote a book, the day that I file for a copyright, the day that I say this is mine, you can't steal it, then it's copyrighted. And you're going to see the little C and a symbol. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But a copyright date is going to be on an inside page, usually before the table of contents in a book. And we'll look at one of those in a minute. And on your website, a lot of times it's at the very, very bottom of the page. So students often miss it. But most of that stuff will have a copyright because we want people to know that it's ours. We have a publisher. A lot of students don't think about the fact that your book is made by a company. We need to give that company credit for creating it, for printing all the pictures and the words and everything that's in it, for binding it together. It's not just the person who wrote it we have to give credit for. So we have to look for that too. Sometimes those of us who teach these classes will refer to journals or periodicals, and I realize this isn't something you encounter in your everyday life all that often, so I want to make sure you know what that is. The best way to explain it is to think of it like an academic newspaper. So if I'm in a particular field, say I'm a scientist, then there might be a newspaper of some sort that contains a bunch of articles put together. It might be in print, it might be online, it might be both, about a specific topic. So whatever area of science I'm in, I'm going to have different researchers and different professors who are contributing information. And I'm going to compile that. And usually there are several of those published each year. We're going to have several of those. Within those, we often have volume and issue numbers, and a lot of students will see these numbers and not really know what they mean. Once you know what they mean, it's a lot easier to figure out where they go in your citation. So what I say is think of it like a TV series, because that's the thing we all have experience with, right? So if I'm watching Game of Thrones, I'm watching season 1, but I'm watching episode 6, right? That's exactly how the journals work. So I'm reading this journal, I'm reading the first volume of it, but it might be the 6th issue in that month, okay? If it's really prolific. So it works the same way, and that's what those numbers mean. And once you know what they are, then they're easier to spot and they're easier to use in this new format. And then the last one is, a lot of times students come to the writing lab and I say, did you get it from a database? And everybody's eyes glaze over. What's that? Because it's gotten to the point now where so many things are online that we don't realize that they're categorized in different ways. So I might find, for example, WebMD, that's a medical site, right, where we could go to find out if I have a cold or the flu. If I go to that website, that's a website. But if I go to the library's website and I start looking at articles there, I have to log in and I'll have that list of journals that'll pop up. That's a database, right? So something like Literature Resource Center might be one that you might be using. Academic Search Complete. It's a database which is basically like a giant filing cabinet for online articles. It's a place where they're located. So it's different than, you see how that's different than the journal itself, because a database might have 10 journals in it that are on a particular subject, okay? So once we understand all of that, then this gets a little bit easier to do. Okay, so what MLA has come up with is something called the container approach. So a particular way that we are going to kind of decide how to cite everything. And the thing to remember is just look at the punctuation really quick, because as we get into the details, you're going to forget about those periods and commas, right? So periods after the first two, commas all the way down, and then a period at the end, okay? And that's how we're going to do that. So there are going to be 9 things that we're looking for. The great thing about the container approach is that unlike in the past where we had to write, N period, D period for no date, we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have a date, we skip that container. We throw that container right out, okay? So we don't have to write all those extra abbreviations in. So what we're going to be doing is looking at this list every time, and I'm going to show you how to cite different types of sources. And as we look at this list, we're going to say, what do we have, where do we find it, and then how do we put it into the citation properly, basically. Okay, so let's talk about print sources, because most of you are going to have a textbook, at least at one point or another, you're going to have to cite. If we look, this is the thing that students often, I'll say, have you looked at the copyright page? You need a publisher. Where did I find that? This is a copy, and I know that you can't read all the handwriting, but I wanted to show you where on the page it was located, right? This is from the They Say, I Say book that a lot of you have probably used or seen. And if we look, there's that C symbol. That tells me what year it was published. And if you could read it very clearly, there are about 6 different years listed, which sometimes confuses students. Just use the year that is the most recent, right? Because that means they've updated it all these times, but hopefully the book you're holding is going to be that most recent one, and that's what we're citing. Always cite the source you're using, okay? The publisher is usually on there in 2 places. What I tell students to do is, because remember what we talked about before, a publisher is a company, which means that their name might have the word company in it. It might have the word incorporated in it, or Inc., right? Their abbreviation for incorporated. It might have the word press. Almost all of the textbooks that we have are going to use one of those 3. So if you're not sure what the publisher is, that's something to look for, okay? And it's going to be in one of those 2 places on the page. But every book has to have one of these pages. So it's in there. You just got to look for it, okay? Okay, so let's imagine that I'm going to cite just a book. Let's say it's a novel, okay? And I'm reading it for class, and I want to quote from it in my paper. And I need to give credit to my sources. Students often say, I want to start with the part that goes in the text. And I say it's actually a better idea to start with your Works Cited page, and I'm going to show you guys why. So we'll get to the in the text. But let's imagine I have a quote in my paper, and I want to cite it from this book that we're going to talk about in a second. So I'm going to look at the containers, and I'm going to say, okay, if on the front cover, what information do I have? I have the author's name, always, right? And I have the title of the book. That's the title of my source. So that's number 1 and number 2. I also have, if I look at the copyright page, which is going to be just inside that cover, I'm going to have a publisher and a publication date. So I'm going to know when it was published and by who. Look at all those things down there at the bottom. Those are things I don't need. Your average novel is not going to have numbers or volume numbers or any of those things. So we're going to just throw those out right now. So really we're just using 1, 2, 7, and 8 for this. And this is what it would look like. And I'm going to keep using the same color so we can kind of get used to the pattern, okay? So this is a book probably a lot of you have already heard about. A lot of students are reading it right now. Timothy O'Brien wrote The Things They Carried. Notice that book title is in italics. Book titles always go in italics. That hasn't changed. Houghton Mifflin is the company that published it, and that's the year. If I only used a specific section of it, I would add some page numbers to that. But let's say I'm citing from all over the place in this novel, in my paper, okay? That's what I would have to do. I wouldn't have to worry about any of those containers that I don't have, that I'm not using, okay? All right, so let's imagine that we're looking at something, that anthology thing we talked about before, a collection, where there might be lots of different authors in my book. Like They Say, I Say, right? So we're still going to look at that list of containers, and we're going to look and see, okay, what information do I have? It's always the first question that you ask yourself. So we'll look at the actual, let's say it's a short story, okay? Say I'm using the Norton Anthology, and I look and I see a short story in there, and I want to write my paper about the yellow wallpaper. If I'm writing about the yellow wallpaper, I'm going to look right at that first page of the story, and I'm going to find the author's name, and I'm going to find the yellow wallpaper, the title of that story. That's the title of my source, because my container, which I'm going to get down to further, is the name of the whole book, which we're going to have to cite as well, okay? But first, I need to know Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the yellow wallpaper. And also, obviously, I know what pages it's on. So you have to actually look and see, okay, this starts on this page and it ends on this page, right? So we're going to have those things. If we look at the front cover of the book, remember that we know the title of the whole book, Norton Anthology of American Literature or British Literature, whatever it is. We have the editors' names, the people who compiled all these stories, who decided what stories would go in and what stories would be left out. That's most of what the editor is doing. They're also the people who write those introductions, right? So when we start the chapter, there's an introduction. This is a chapter about, women's writing, and we're going to give you some background information. The editors usually write that. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote the yellow wallpaper, and we're going to give her credit and them credit, because they were part of the project. So there are always when you have an anthology, there's always more than one set of names you're going to have to include, okay? A lot of students miss that. We have our other contributors, so we did that, we've got our version. Let's say it's the 3rd edition or the 6th edition. We're going to have to make sure we include that too, because the reason we come up with a new edition is because something has changed, right? So we don't want to give them the wrong information. Because the whole point of citing, right, is so that if I find something and I'm interested in looking at it, if I want to read the story that you wrote about, I can go back and I can find exactly where that book is located. It's partly about giving credit to your source, but it's also partly about letting people find more information on whatever it is you're writing about. And if you've written a good paper, then hopefully you'll get them excited about doing that, right? As excited as you can be about this. So at the very end, we're going to look for that copyright page, which is inside the cover of the book again, right? And we're going to find the publisher and the publication date, because every book has one of those. So if we look, the only thing we're missing is we don't have a number. We have no volume numbers that we need to include, because our book doesn't have that, so we just throw that out. And then this shows what that's going to look like. This is a They Say, I Say example. So Nicholas Carr wrote my specific article. It's called Is Google Making Us Stupid? They Say, I Say is the title of the book. Notice I've given the whole title because we want to be as clear as possible. Because, for example, They Say, I Say has an edition that doesn't have readings in it. I know because my students sometimes buy the wrong one. So make sure that's included so we know which book you're using. We have the editors' names. Notice we're not reversing them. See how we've reversed Nicholas Carr's name. We put his last name first. We don't need to do that with the editors. We have our 3rd edition there because that's our version. We have the name of the publisher and the year it was published. And then we have the pages that article appears, just that article. So it's only those few pages. Because I'm only citing Nicholas Carr. Now, if I need to cite 2 articles from this book, most of my job is already done for me, right? If I want to choose, say there's an author named Smith, and I want to use his article in my paper as well, that's great. All I'm going to need to do is change the green part and the blue part, because the rest of that, and the page numbers, the rest of that is going to stay pretty much the same because it's the same book. That's okay. We still need to have all that information there. Okay? So every source has to be accounted for. Okay, so library database articles. Basically, at this school, we got together with the librarians to come up with a way to cite those articles because we know how much you're using them. The bad news is that if you use them and you're used to using them in the past, there's a citation at the bottom. It just says, this is how you cite this in MLA. Unfortunately, like everything else, that hasn't yet been updated. So we're going to try to figure out how to do this on our own. Again, we look at the top of the article, right? And we find the author and the title of the article itself. At the very end, we're going to find the name of the database. So look at the database names usually have some sort of logo with them. there's EBSCO, there's Academic Search Complete, there's Literature Resource Center. So we have several to choose from. We need to find that. We also need to find the publisher, which is not the same thing, because a database just collects journals. So I need to know both where did this appear originally, and now it appears in my database that has a name. So I need both of those names in order to cite it. A lot of students leave one or the other out, okay? I have a volume and issue numbers, which you'll probably find it, right there at the end of the article. Sometimes it's at the top, sometimes it's at the bottom. You're gonna have to hunt around for it. We're gonna have a publication date, of course. There might be more than one publication date. There might be a date that it was put in the database, and there might be a date that it was originally published, and I'm going to show you what to do with that in a second. And then, of course, you might have page numbers depending on how it's set up. It'll list that information. So, if you see, what happens is we found this source in the Literature Resource Center database. See how that goes first? Then I write out originally published in, because there's a journal called the New Republic that we need to give credit to, because that's where this originally comes from. Now you might be thinking, I thought you said that with web sources, we could just use the URL, right? I don't know how many of you have ever seen the URL addresses that go along with those database articles. Anybody? They are very long. So part of the reason why we're going to do it this way is to avoid your Works Cited page for a short 4-page paper being 4 or 5 pages long, right? Because your instructors don't want to have all that. Plus, as you know, you have to log into the library website. So if you give me a link, I'm not going to be able to get directly to that article. I'm going to have to sign in, and I'm going to have to hope that it goes to where I asked it to go, right? So this is going to make that easier for instructors, and it's a little bit easier for you too, since all that information is going to be at the top or at the very bottom of the article. But we need to know where it was published. We need to know what volume and issue number it is. We need to know the year, and we need to know what pages it appears on in that journal, if those are available. Sometimes those aren't, okay? So that's how we're going to handle that. That's the only web source you're going to use where you don't need to add the URL address, is when you're using our library and you're using those databases in it, okay, when you signed into the PSC library webpage. Okay, so a lot of students use web sources. Using book sources is becoming, obsolete in some situations other than your textbook, right? So web sources are usually what students ask me about the most and what causes the most confusion. So when we use the container approach, the web sources are relatively simple, but you have to hunt around for the information. The great thing about a journal article is that it's been peer reviewed. There are scholars in that discipline, whatever discipline it is you're citing something from, let's say it's psychology, who've looked at that, and we know that it's credible. With a website, you really have to be more careful. You have to decide, is this website, who's responsible for this website? Am I sure that this information is going to be reputable enough for a college paper? Because since a lot of you are going to be writing things like argument papers, you don't want to use a source that's going to make you look bad, right? That's like bringing someone who doesn't know anything up here and asking them to explain this to you. That would make me look bad, right? So you don't want to do that. Don't use bad sources. So first, if you're using a web source, double check and make sure it's a good one. And you have to have a reason for that. Why is that? Who's involved with it? Where do we get this information from? Is this biased information? Because if it is, then maybe I don't want to use it, because it's not going to help support my argument very well in my paper, right? There are good websites out there, but you have to be somewhat careful. And the librarians are a really good source for helping you choose. So if you have questions about that, I always send students to them, because they have kind of a system that helps you evaluate what's a good source versus what isn't, okay? But let's say we decided it was a good source, and we're definitely going to use it, but we need to figure out how to cite it. Obviously, we know we can copy and paste that address bar at the very top, so that we can have the exact URL where that came from. So we're going to do that. We're going to look for the container. So a lot of students will say, for example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. A lot of students cite that, which is a government site that has good information. If I'm citing that piece of information, a lot of students will put in their in-text citations, CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, right? Well, that's the container. That's the larger source that this particular article is in. Do you know how many articles they have? A lot, on a lot of different diseases and conditions and warnings and things. So if that's the only information you give me, I'm not going to be able to get to the source that you are using in your paper. But if you give me the title of the article itself, or the page itself, a lot of times you're looking at websites and I'll say, what's the name of the article? And students will say, well, it isn't an article. It's just a page about the death penalty. And I'll say, well, what does it say at the top of that page? because that is the title of the article, as far as we're concerned, okay? That's the title of your source. So if all the title is death penalty facts, that's fine. That needs to go in your citation though, because it's not, that way when I get to the CTC's website, I know which part of it to look for, okay? Let's imagine that my URL got lost. I need to know which section of the website this comes from. Because the more information we give people about the sources we're using, the more credible we look, and the easier it is for someone to come back and take a look at it later, if they're interested in fact-checking us or getting more information about that topic, okay? So also we want to think about the fact that a lot of web sources don't have authors. And a lot of students will just look at it and say, nope, I don't see anyone. But really make sure. Remember what I said earlier, if you wrote something, you would want credit for it, right? So really double check the bottom of the article and the top of the article. Make sure there isn't a specific name listed for somebody who wrote it, because if there is, that needs to go on here, and they need credit for that, okay? It actually makes your citation a little bit easier if there is an author, so it's worth looking for that reason too. Okay, and then obviously the publication date. A lot of times students will tell me that they don't have a date. There's no date listed. Most websites have a date listed. It might be a last updated date. It might be at the very bottom of the page. Most of the time there is a date. It just might not be as easy to find. Hunt around for it because we need to know how current this information is, especially when you get out of your English classes and you're writing papers for classes in the sciences, for example. They're going to want to know if you're citing some sort of piece of research that's from 1970 versus something that's from 2015. That's going to make a huge difference. In literature, maybe not as much of a difference, but it's going to matter. So make sure that that's also included. It also helps people find the source again, right? So we're going to make sure we look for that. We're throwing the things out that we're not using, which are things like the other contributors, the version and the number. You're not going to probably find that. There are some exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We might not have a publisher, and we might have a publisher. It really depends. I'm going to say this particular website doesn't really have a publisher, but you might find something. So if we look at our citation, this is how that's basically going to work if you have an author. So we have a name, title, eHow is the website that we're using, the whole website. That's our larger container, the date, and then we have our whole URL copied and pasted there. Notice that we took out that HTTP part of it. That doesn't need to be in there, okay? We don't want to make it any longer than it has to be, right? Okay, but what happens is a lot of times you'll get a web page and you're like, I swear to you, I have looked through everything and I don't have all the things I need. And a lot of times students panic, especially when I tell them that you don't have to write things like no date and no page like we used to. So we want to look, there are a couple places we need to look. We need to figure out what do we have, because that's always our first question. We obviously have a web address because we're on the web. We have to have some sort of website that's publishing this information, and we have to have a title of the page that we're looking at. If those two things happen to be the same thing, that's the new rule with MLA. If I have duplicates, so say the publisher and the website are the same thing, I only use one of them, and probably the first one, okay? Use your best judgment on that. This allows for some wiggle room. As long as you're using the container approach and you're giving me as much information as you can, you get to decide a little bit how that goes, as long as you're following their format. So let's say that this is all we have, and we really don't have those things. Then we're going to do something like this. And this right here illustrates why I tell students to do their Works Cited page first. Because if you don't do your Works Cited page first, you're going to be tempted to put WebMD in your in-text citations. You're going to quote from that site, and then you're going to put that in parentheses afterwards. But that's not correct, because what comes first in our citation is always what goes on our Works Cited page, is always what goes first in our text itself. So in this case, I would actually be putting athlete's foot topic overview, or at least athlete's foot, in quotation marks, in parentheses, in my paper itself. I would definitely not write something like no author. I would not include that entire URL address because it's pretty long, right? So we need to know what needs to go in the in-text citations, and the easiest way to do that is to do the Works Cited page first. Notice that I included an access date for this one because I couldn't find a publication date on this website. I looked everywhere, I couldn't find it. So when there isn't a publication date, I write out the word accessed, and then I give the date. And that's going to be in what some of you know as military format or international time format, where we go day, month, year. And you use that format, okay? And all the dates in MLA are that way. That goes for the date at the top of your paper too, technically, okay? All right, so now that we've kind of covered that, what you will find sometimes is most of the time the journal articles you're going to be using are going to be from the databases, and that's good because those have been peer reviewed. But there are some good websites out there, such as this Science Online that I found, where there are journal articles that are available on the web. Because what happens is the library pays for a subscription for some of those databases. So like JSTOR, which has a lot of really good sources on literature. The library pays that company to have that database available for you. But there are some free ones on the web that aren't too bad, depending on your topic. Okay, this one probably won't relate to any of your topics, but there's a science one that's really good. When you find a journal article on the web, you're going to see that you have more information that you can include in your citation. So I just wanted to make sure you kind of saw what this looked like. We'd have a container, so we'd have the name of the journal, we'd have an author and a title. We're going to have those volume and issue numbers because it's a journal. It's just a journal that's published on the web only. And we're going to have all of our publication information. So it's going to look something like this, which is very similar to the database ones that we did, except we're going to use a URL address this time, okay? Because it won't be originally published somewhere else. It'll be published on the web right where you're looking at it. And so you're going to include it like that. And you see I have a publication date, so I don't have to put an access date on this one. Okay, so in-text citations are the things students always want to talk about first, and we've gotten there. In-text citations need to go after every single quote. So if I have a quote in a sentence, I better have some sort of in-text citation in that sentence. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So basically, some people call them in-text, some people call them parenthetical. You'll hear that term too. And that just means within the paragraphs, right, within our text. And what it is it's like a shorthand. So think of it like, you know how you look at a map sometimes? Let's say you're going to an amusement park, and you're going to look at a map, and you want to find out where the bathrooms are. Usually there'll be some sort of legend in the corner, and there'll be like a bathroom symbol, which has like a man and a woman on it. And then you'll look at that symbol, and then you'll look at the map, and you'll find those symbols to figure out where the bathrooms are, right? This works the same way. Your in-text citation gives us a little tiny clue, a little shorthand note, so that when I want to find out more about that source, I skip to the last page and I'll look exactly for that one thing. And that's why it's important to make sure that your in-text citation matches whatever comes first on your Works Cited page. Because if they don't match, I'm not going to make that association. That's like saying the bathrooms are one symbol, and then looking on the map and that symbol doesn't exist. You would just assume there were no bathrooms, right? We don't want that to happen. So it's going to be the same thing. They have to match, and every source has to be accounted for. There shouldn't be anything in your text that isn't also on your Works Cited page and vice versa, okay? So if we're looking at this, we want to also make sure we're avoiding plagiarism, because if I took an idea, a lot of students don't realize, if I took an idea from a source, but I didn't use the exact words, I still need an in-text citation in that sentence. I still need to make it very clear that that wasn't my own idea, it came from somewhere else. So it's not just the exact words, it's anything, an idea, a concept, a statistic, anything like that that isn't considered common knowledge needs to be cited. So, and it's really better to overdo it than underdo it. An instructor who tells you you have too many citations is not going to be too concerned about that. They might point it out, but it's not going to affect your grade massively, right? But an instructor who says you don't have enough citations could give you an F. So it's not worth the risk, okay? So just make sure you're doing it, and if you need help, you can come see us, and I'll show you more information about that later. Also, you want to look like you know what you're doing. So you're writing a paper, I'm using good sources, and I want you to know it. I'm going to put that right in my sentence. And if you want to fact check me, go ahead and do it, because I'm using good sources, and this is exactly where that came from. So think of it like that too. It shows credibility. It shows that you're not just pulling these ideas from your own brain, because maybe you're not an expert, we hope, on the death penalty. But you're writing an argument paper about it, so you found some people who were. You found some statistics that were, right? And of course, to help people find more information. Okay, so the basic things we need to know is when you know the author, I need to see the author everywhere, all over the place, right? I need to see it in the same sentence as any quote or any fact that you took from a source. So, for example, the first one has a quote. So if we're looking at the quote, the text includes many details about medieval life. There's my quote from my source. I need to give the author's name and the page number. No punctuation, no other stuff, right? If you've used APA in science classes, you'll have to use the date in there
Throw that out. We don't use that in MLA. It's just name and page number if I have one, okay? If I don't, I skip the page number, just like everything else. You don't have it, you throw it out, okay? Notice that we can also include the author's name in the sentence itself. So if I put Smith, according to Smith, the text indicates, and then which is a good signal phrase, a good voice marker before my quote, which is good. Then once I put my quote in there, I don't have to say Smith again. It's no crime to say Smith twice because you're giving us even more information than we need, but it's not necessary and it's going to clutter up your paper. So it's a good idea to sort of vary those. Sometimes it's in the in-text citation, sometimes it's in the sentence itself, just to kind of change things up. Then notice the last one, I don't have any quotation marks because I didn't use anyone's exact words. But I did take that very specific statistic, 85%. And if I'd actually read that in an article, which I'm making this up, but if I'd actually read that in an article, that definitely wouldn't be something I just walked around knowing. I know the exact percentage of college students who get the wrong information. No, I don't, right? That's not common knowledge. So since I paraphrased that, since I took that idea, I put it in my own words, but I took that idea, I still have to give credit to the person who gave me the 85%, okay? And a lot of students forget that last step, and that's plagiarism. You want to make sure you don't do that. So I make sure I still have the author's name and the page number if I have it, okay? But then students will say, well, what happens when I don't know the author? And then there's some panic, right? Because we don't want to plagiarize, but we do want to give credit. Well, that's okay because you will already have your Works Cited page done. And once that's done, you'll know that whatever comes first in each of those entries is what goes in your in-text citation. And when we did those, remember the one that didn't have an author? The first part of it was blue because the first part of it was our title. So first we want to make sure this doesn't have an author. Are we sure this is a good source? Make sure that you double check that. Ask the librarians if you need help with that, okay? Because if you just Googled something, chances are it might not be a good source. Double check first. But if you're sure, if it's from the CDC, for example, and you're sure it's going to be a good source, then you're going to start with your title, which means that's what's going to go in your in-text citation. Okay? Notice I can do the same thing. I can make the title part of the sentence. And in this case, I don't have a page number, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm either going to put it in the sentence, or I'm going to put it at the end. Notice what I did in that second one. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention assures parents that the benefits of vaccinating one's child far outweigh the most common side effects. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I wanted to put that in my sentence because I want them to know this is from the source on this information, right? But they're not responsible for just this information. Remember we talked about this before. They have tons and tons of articles. So I can't leave that alone by itself. I have to put the specific article that I'm citing from at the end there. Even though I've included, a lot of students will say, well, I already said it's from the CDC. Why do I have to put a citation at the end? Because I need to know where within that site that information came from, okay? Okay, so that is my whole thing on MLA, and I know that was a lot of information. So what I want to make sure everybody knows is that you can come see us, you can get help from us in a variety of different ways, because I know that was a lot to take in. What we have in the writing lab are worksheets that have many of the same examples you just saw on them. And these are sheets that we'll go over with you, and then we'll send them home with you. So you can even bring your sources in, we'll help you find the information, put the citations together. I even have a bulletin board that has the containers on it, right inside the door when you walk in, okay? So if you're worried about citing your sources, if you're worried about plagiarism, if you're not sure what goes in the in-text citations, if you're not, if you've used a lot of quotes and you want to check to see if they're supporting your ideas, those are all things that we can help you with in the writing lab. So you can come visit us. And for those of you who can't come visit us, look at all the other options we have, okay? We have hours at the other campuses as well. But since we're at this campus, I just put these hours up. But we're open in the evenings, we're open on Sundays. So there's lots of time for you to come by and see us. You don't have to make an appointment. You can just drop in when you need help. And the handouts are available whether you need to speak to me or not, whether you just want to look at a template and follow it, that's fine. You can come pick that up from us, okay? You can also email us your paper. So you're writing a research paper, you'll email us, and then you'll get an auto response back right away. And it'll say, make sure you fill out this survey. When you click on the survey, one of your options of what kind of help you need is to tell me, I need help with MLA formatting, okay? And documenting my sources. So you check that box, and then we will give you links to the same handouts that we have in person. and we'll explain what changes you need to make, okay? So email is another possibility. Keep in mind, if you email us, it's going to take 24 to 48 business hours to get back to you. So if you wait until the very last second, don't wait till the very last second. But if you wait till the last day, come by and see us, because I can help you, tweak those citations in person much more quickly than I can through email, okay? So just know that that's going to take a little bit longer. We also have virtual tutoring available, so keep that in mind. Virtual tutoring, you will see my actual face. You'll be able to talk to me if you have a microphone. There'll be like webcam pictures in one corner. We'll put the paper in the middle of the screen, and we'll also have chat function, so if you don't have a webcam or a microphone, you can still log in. And basically, several of you will be able to be in there at once, and we can talk about how to cite a book, for example. Or we can also give you feedback on your paper that way. So, and if you look in Canvas, PSC Virtual Writing Tutoring is going to pop up for all of you. It's in there. If you look around, the schedule, all the information about how that works, even how to do it, how to log in, how to get set up, is in there. It's really not that difficult, so don't shy away from it. It's all built into Canvas, so most of it does the work for you, okay? And if you don't have a webcam or that kind of thing, you can still access it. So, lots and lots of ways to get help, which means nobody should be struggling when there's that much free help available, right? So don't be afraid. We're very nice people, I promise. And we know MLA backwards and forwards. We also have the handbook, so if you come in with a source that was translated from French and published 4 times, we will find the answer for you. We will come up with a way to cite that source, okay? So please stop by and see us for all the papers you're writing throughout your whole time at PSC. And that's my whole spiel. Does anybody have any